The trail camera had one photo dated 2:14 a.m., time-stamped the night before I'm telling you this. It was of me. I was standing at the fire line with my back to the lens, holding a lantern that isn't mine, in a stance I don't remember taking, and I was asleep in my bed the entire night. I checked. I always check. It's the first thing I do every morning at Whitlock Station, before coffee, before the radio, before anything. I check the boots by the door, because a ranger's boots tell you more about the night before than his memory does. And mine were dry, bone dry. Not a fleck of the mud that was on the ground under that camera, not a single pine needle caught in the laces. And yet, there I was, on the little SD card the camera saves too, standing 40 yards into the black timber at the exact hour I would have sworn under oath I was under a wool blanket with the space heater humming. I want to tell you that my first reaction was fear. It wasn't. My first reaction was procedural, because that's what 15 years of search and rescue and 4 years of federal forestry work does to a person. It replaces your instincts with checklists. I pulled the card. I logged the anomaly in the daily activity report the way I'd log a downed tree across a fire road, and I told myself calmly, in the exact tone I'd use to talk a panicking hiker off a ledge. There is an explanation for this. Cameras get their internal clocks wrong. Someone borrowed my jacket. I sleepwalk, and I don't know it. Any of those things could be true. I wrote them down in order of likelihood the way I write everything down. Because if you write a thing down enough times in enough careful little boxes, it stops being able to hurt you. That's what I believed anyway, back when I still thought a logbook was a wall and not a door. My name is Owen Marsh, and before you decide what kind of story this is, I want you to understand what kind of man I was before Whitlock, because the forest didn't choose me at random, and neither will it choose whoever reads this next. I was a search and rescue technician for 11 years before I ever wore a Forest Service uniform, and for the 2 years before that, I ran incident command on volunteer call-outs in country steep and cold enough to kill a healthy man in 3 hours, if the weather turned. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, without the false modesty men like me hide behind, because it matters to what happened next. I was good at it. I was careful. I followed protocol to the letter, and following protocol to the letter is the reason a 15-year-old boy named Caleb Reyes is still somewhere on Sable Ridge, under snow that melted 4 times since, in a place we stopped looking for him at 6:52 p.m. On a Tuesday, because the lightning was 30 seconds off, and our own safety manual said we pull back at that mark, no exceptions. No matter what the radio traffic from the boy's father sounded like when we told him. We pulled back. The storm hit 40 minutes later and buried the ridge in 11 inches by morning. We resumed the search at first light and found his pack 60 yards from where we'd have reached him if we'd had 1 more hour. We never found Caleb. 3 years, 4 departments, 2 K-9 units, and a psychic his mother paid out of pocket after we gave up nothing. He is, officially, a name on a laminated card in a filing cabinet in a county sheriff's office, and unofficially, he is the reason I begged for, if I'm honest, though I dressed it up in the language of career development on the transfer, form a quiet post. Somewhere with no peaks, no technical rescues, no radio traffic that could ever again sound like that boy's father's voice. Somewhere I could just walk trails and write reports and let the forest be a forest, instead of a place where children go missing under my direct authority. They gave me Whitlock. I should tell you about Whitlock the way the Forest Service tells you about it, which is to say, barely. It's a mid-elevation tract, 41,000 acres of second and third growth timber with a stubborn core of old growth in the northeast quadrant that somehow escaped 3 separate logging leases across 100 years. Hemlock and Douglas fir standing so thick and so old that the canopy blocks enough light to keep the understory nearly bare. Just moss and duff and the kind of silence that isn't peaceful so much as attentive. There's one manned station, a ranger's cabin built in the 50s and reclad twice since. One decommissioned fire lookout, Tower 9 they call it on the old maps. Though the numbering system that would explain why there's a 9 and not a 1 has been lost to whatever office used to track that, and about 60 miles of maintained trail feeding off a single trailhead outside a town called Coro's Bend, population 400 and shrinking. That exists mostly because a mill used to be there and now isn't. Here is the thing about Whitlock that isn't in any official document, that I had to learn the way you learn everything that actually matters in a small place. Nobody goes in after dark. Not hikers, not hunters, not the mill families who've lived along its edge for 4 generations, not even the 2 other rangers on rotating coverage who I inherited the post from. There's no gate. There's no posted curfew. If you ask the district office in writing why nighttime entry into Whitlock isn't permitted, they'd tell you, and it's even in the management plan if you dig, that it's a wildlife corridor protection measure elk calving activity in spring, sensitive nocturnal species monitoring the rest of the year, standard language you'd find copy-pasted across a dozen forests that have never had a single wolf or elk cross their boundary in a decade. It is, technically, a rule with a reason. It is also, I would come to learn, a rule that predates the reason by at least 70 years, because nobody in Corro's Bend needed a wildlife management plan to tell them not to be inside those trees when the light went out of the sky. They just didn't. It wasn't a decision they made. It was closer to how you don't put your hand on a stove, not a rule you follow so much as a thing your body already knows. I didn't know any of that yet, that first week. I knew I had a station, a truck, a radio, a patrol schedule, and 60 miles of trail to learn by foot before the snow came. And after Sable Ridge, after Caleb, I wanted nothing more in the world than exactly that distance, procedure, silence that didn't ask anything of me. I built my systems the way I always build my systems, because if there is one thing search and rescue teaches you that never leaves, it's that the person who survives the bad day is the person whose systems didn't depend on how they were feeling that morning. I logged every patrol, every mile, every gate check, every trailhead register entry cross-referenced against my GPS track, filed and dated and initialed, and for 11 days that system held the forest at exactly the distance I needed it at. On the 12th day, I found the photograph of myself standing in the black timber at 2:14 in the morning, and the distance collapsed. I want to walk you through what I did next in order, because the order matters. Because the horror of this, if you want to call it that, was never a single moment. It was a sequence, each link small enough to explain away on its own, and it was only much later, once I understood what those links were actually building toward, that I understood how carefully, how patiently something had been laying them out for me, one at a time, exactly as fast as I could stand to find them. The first thing I did, after logging the camera anomaly and inventing 3 rational explanations for it, was check my truck's odometer against the mileage I'd logged the day before. It matched. That should have reassured me. It didn't. Quite, because a camera's internal clock being wrong is a coincidence you can live with once. But I found myself, against my own advice to myself, pulling the memory cards from the other 4 trail cameras I'd set on the northeast boundary the week before. Standard wildlife monitoring, the kind of unremarkable data collection that makes up 90% of a ranger's actual job, motion-triggered, checked every 10 days, feeding a spreadsheet nobody above me will ever read. 3 of the 4 cards had nothing but deer, 1 raccoon, and a bear that ambled through at dusk on the 9th. The 4th card, the one closest to the old growth boundary near a game trail I'd flagged as active, had 11 photographs. 10 of them were mine. Not photographs of me from that night, photographs of me from every night since I'd set the camera. 11:58 p.m., 1:20 a.m., 2:14 a.m., again, a different night. 3:41 a.m. Always alone, always walking the same direction, deeper into the stand, always with that lantern I have never owned in my life. A kerosene model with a cracked chimney glass, the kind the Forest Service stopped issuing sometime around when Eisenhower was in office. In every photograph, my face was turned 3/4 away from the lens, like I knew exactly where the camera was and had decided, deliberately, not to look at it. The 11th photograph was different. It wasn't me. It was a boy. He was standing where I usually stood in the other 10, in the same spot, at roughly the same angle, as though whatever pattern generated my image had briefly generated his, instead small for his age, maybe 14 or 15, wearing a jacket too thin for the season, and his face, unlike mine, was turned directly at the camera, looking straight into it, straight at whoever would eventually pull that card. His expression wasn't fear and it wasn't pain. It was closer to patience, the patience of someone who has been standing in one place for a very long time and has stopped expecting anyone to come. I did not at that moment let myself think of Caleb Reyes. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be easy, telling this now, to make it sound like I knew immediately, like the grief and the guilt announced themselves the second I saw a boy's face on a game camera in a forest 1,400 miles from Sable Ridge. I didn't let myself think it. I filed it under unidentified subject possible trespasser, and I drove into Corro's Bend that afternoon under the very reasonable, very procedural pretext of checking whether any local teenager had a habit of wandering the boundary trails at night, because that's the kind of thing a responsible ranger does. And I've spent 3 years building a life around being a responsible ranger instead of the man who called off a search 40 minutes too early. Corro's Bend has one store that sells gas, ammunition, fishing tackle, and enough groceries to keep a household running for a week without a 2-hour drive to the county seat, and it's run by a man named Harlan who has, as far as I can tell, run it since some point in the previous century, and intends to keep running it until he simply stops existing behind the counter one afternoon, mid-sentence, the way I imagine men like Harlan eventually do. I asked him casually whether any local kids like to hike the Whitlock boundary trails after school, maybe camp out near the old growth line. He didn't answer right away. He finished ringing up a bag of birdseed for the woman ahead of me, made her change, wished her a good afternoon, and only once she was out the door did he look at me, not unkindly, but the way you look at someone who has asked a question they don't yet understand the weight of. "You're the new ranger," he said. Not a question. I told him I was, 3 weeks in, and that I'd noticed some camera activity near the boundary I wanted to rule out before I logged it as trespass. "Camera activity," Harlan repeated, and something moved behind his eyes that I would later recognize once I understood what it was, as pity. "You checking cameras at night?" I said the cameras were motion-triggered, that they ran all night regardless of who was checking them, and he nodded slowly, like that confirmed something rather than answered it. "Nobody local goes in after dark," he said. "Never has, long as I've been here, long as my father was here before me. You'll hear it from anybody in town if you ask, and if they've got any sense, they'll tell you the same thing I'm about to, which is, don't ask why. Just don't be in there when the light goes." I asked him why, because of course I did, because I am the kind of man who has to write the reason down in a box before I can believe it, and Harlan looked at me for a long moment and said something I wrote down almost verbatim that night, in the station logbook. In the personal notes column I keep separate from the official entries, because even then some part of me understood it wasn't a thing I could afford to let myself half remember later. "They send rangers out here who've already lost somebody," he said. "Not always, but more than you'd think for a posting nobody wants. You lose somebody up on a ridge somewhere or in a river or wherever it was, and then a slot opens up out here, and somehow it's always you they send. I don't know how that works, and I've stopped trying to figure it, because there's things about this valley smarter men than me have gone looking for the why of and come back wrong in the head, if they came back at all. What I know is this: the woods have been here longer than the town, and the town's rule about the dark is older than anybody's memory of why we made it. And every ranger I've known who broke that rule on purpose, out of curiosity or grief or just plain stubbornness, none of them finished out their posting here. Some transferred sudden, no notice, gone in a week. One of them didn't. I asked him what happened to the one who didn't. He rang up my coffee and my gas without answering. And when I pushed gently, the way you push a witness who's decided they've said enough, he told me the name of the man who'd had the post before the man who'd had it before me, a ranger named Corwin Voss, who'd served 11 years at Whitlock without incident and then, in his 12th spring, stopped filing reports for 6 days before anybody thought to check on him. And when the district supervisor finally drove out, Voss's truck was at the station, his radio was on the desk mid-transmission with the mic keyed open, and Voss himself was never found. Officially, it's listed as a transfer. Harlan said it the way you'd correct someone's grammar, a small, tired, unnecessary act of honesty. Officially, he said, is a word that means somebody decided not to write down what actually happened. That should have been the moment I turned around and drove back to district and asked for a different post, and I think if I had known, right then, standing in Harlan's store with a coffee going cold in my hand, exactly how far the thing I was standing next to actually reached, I might have. But I didn't know yet. I knew a rumor and a photograph of a boy's face and a set of pictures of myself sleepwalking through 50 acres of old growth I had no memory of entering. And every one of those things, taken alone, had an explanation that let me keep my job and keep my routine, and keep above everything else the version of myself I had built specifically to survive Caleb Reyes, the version who trusted procedure over feeling, evidence over instinct, the log over the fear. So I drove back to Whitlock Station, and I did what that version of me does when the world doesn't make sense. I started a file. I want to be clear that I don't think of what I did next as brave, or even particularly wise. I think looking back that it was the exact opposite of both. It was compulsive. It was the behavior of a man whose only coping mechanism is the illusion of control, and the forest, if I can even use that word for what I now understand, was watching me build this file with something between patience and what I can only describe as recognition. Let me have every inch of that illusion until it had exactly what it needed from me. I pulled every trailhead register going back through the previous ranger's tenure, boxes of them in the equipment shed behind the station, water-stained at the edges, sun-bleached where they'd sat near the one window. And I started reading every entry, every hiker's name, every stated destination, every departure time, and, where it existed, every return time. Because Whitlock requires self-registration at the trailhead kiosk, an honor system with a pencil on a string, the kind of soft procedural gesture that exists mostly so the Forest Service can say it tried if something ever goes wrong. Most entries were unremarkable. Day hikers, a few overnight backpackers, hunters in season, the occasional research team from the state university doing forest health surveys. What I was looking for, and what I found, faster than I wanted to, was the pattern in the ones that weren't unremarkable. Going back as far as the registers existed, and they existed patchily, back to the early 60s, there was, on average, one entry every 18 to 24 months where a hiker signed in for a day trip and never signed out, and where the follow-up notes, scrawled in a dozen different rangers' handwriting across 60 years, all said some version of the same three things: search conducted, subject not located, no trace after 72 hours, case referred to county, presumed lost or presumed deceased. Some of these had names I could have found in old newspaper archives if I'd wanted to spend the afternoon confirming it, and some of the names I noticed with a specific kind of cold I hadn't felt since the radio call that told me Caleb's pack had been found empty, were the names of teenagers, boys mostly between 13 and 16. Not every year, not even every case, but often enough, laced through 6 decades of otherwise mundane hiking registers, that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something closer to a rhythm. A low, patient, recurring note underneath 60 years of ordinary forest business. Here is where the escalation properly began, because up to that point, I could still tell myself I was simply a careful man doing careful research into a tragic but explicable local pattern. Remote forests swallow people. That's not supernatural. That's terrain and weather and bad luck compounding across enough decades. What broke that explanation, what I found on the second night, buried at the bottom of the equipment shed under a decade of unrelated maintenance paperwork, was a second logbook. Not the trailhead register. A station log, the internal one, the kind I keep myself every single day. Patrol notes and equipment checks and weather observations, meant only for the ranger on post and whoever reviews the file after them. It had Corwin Voss's name on the cover, and it continued for 4 months past the date the district office listed as his transfer. I sat on the shed floor with that logbook for longer than I want to admit, going through page after page in handwriting that started, in the early entries, distinctly different from mine, tighter, more slanted, and ended. In the final weeks, in handwriting I would have sworn, if you'd shown it to me without context, was my own. Not similar, not close. Mine. The same particular way I cross a lowercase t high and to the left, the same habit of underlining the word confirmed twice when a search came back negative, a habit I picked up on Sable Ridge and have never once seen another person do. The entries themselves in those final weeks stopped being about elk counts and trail maintenance and started slowly, entry by entry, becoming about a boy Voss had begun seeing at the tree line at dusk. He never named him. He described him the way you'd describe a fact you were trying to verify rather than a person you were afraid of: height, approximate age, clothing, the direction he stood in relative to the old fire road, the exact number of minutes he remained visible before the light failed enough to lose him. Voss's last entry, dated 4 months after his official transfer date, read only, "He's closer to the tower tonight than he's ever been. I think he wants me to follow the light." Below that, in different ink, was a second line, added later, and this is the detail that made me put the logbook down and walk outside into full daylight and stand there until my hands stopped shaking, because it was written in handwriting I did not recognize as Voss's or as my own, an older, looser hand, almost feminine in its care, and it said simply, "Tell the next one it isn't the boy who chooses." I did not sleep that night, and when I say I did not sleep, I mean I sat at the station desk with every light in the cabin on, radio at low volume for company, coffee going bitter in the pot, doing the only thing I know how to do. When the ground stops making sense under me, I made a list. I have always made lists. It is, I think, the closest thing I have to a religion. I wrote down every fact I could verify, separate from every fact I could only infer, and by 3 in the morning the verified column read like this. A trail camera had photographed me asleep in my bed by all available evidence, walking the old growth at exactly 2:14 a.m. on at least 3 separate nights. The same camera had, once, photographed a boy standing in the same position I usually occupied in those photographs, looking directly into the lens with an expression I can only describe as waiting. A predecessor ranger named Corwin Voss had vanished 11 years into an unremarkable career, had continued by all evidence of his own handwriting to file logbook entries for 4 months after his official transfer date, and had described in increasingly fixated detail a boy he saw at dusk near a decommissioned fire tower who he believed wanted him to follow a light, and someone not Voss, not me, someone whose handwriting appeared exactly once, in a book that had otherwise sat sealed in a shed for the better part of a decade, had left a message intended explicitly for whoever came after him. For the next one. I was the next one. That was the fact I could no longer file under any rational category. I need to tell you what I did the following morning, because it's the moment I think of now as the true beginning, not the photograph, not the logbook, but this. I drove to the trailhead kiosk at first light, the way I did every morning, to check the previous day's sign-ins before opening the gate for public access, and taped to the inside of the registration box, where only someone who opened it with the actual maintenance key could have placed it, was a single Polaroid photograph, old stock, the kind that yellows at the border after enough years. It showed the same tree line near the old growth boundary, the same angle roughly as my trail camera, at what had to be dusk given the quality of the light. And standing in the frame, small, patient, looking directly into whatever lens had taken it, was the boy. Except it wasn't only the boy. Beside him, half a step back, was a second figure I recognized instantly, with the specific lurch of recognition that comes from having looked at your own face in a mirror every morning for 34 years. It was me. I don't know how old that photograph was. Polaroid stock from that era stopped being manufactured well before I was born. I don't know who developed it, who placed it in that box, or how they knew where I'd find it and when. What I knew, standing at that kiosk with the morning fog still low enough to touch the tops of the ferns, was that whatever this was had stopped being a pattern I was investigating from a safe procedural distance. It had already put me in the photograph. It had done that, apparently, before I had ever set foot in Whitlock at all. I want to slow down here because everything after this point moves faster than I'm comfortable with. And I think it's important you understand what kind of man was about to walk into that forest, because it explains everything that came after, better than the forest itself ever will. I had spent 3 years building a life out of rules, specifically because rules don't ask you how you feel. A rule doesn't care that you loved a boy you never met the way you love every subject you're responsible for finding. Doesn't care that you can still hear his father's voice cracking on the radio at 6:52 p.m. when you told him you were pulling the team back for the night. A rule just says, this far, no further. These are the hours. This is the protocol. Follow it, and you will have done everything a person could reasonably be asked to do. I had rebuilt myself entirely around that promise, and the forest, whatever it was, whatever intelligence or hunger or grief moved underneath 60 years of hiker registers, and one dead man's handwriting bleeding slowly into mine, had found the exact seam in that promise and begun, patiently, pulling it apart one verified fact at a time. Because here is the thing about a man who needs everything written down and confirmed twice. Eventually, he can't stop reading. The days that followed, I kept working, because the alternative calling district requesting immediate reassignment, admitting that 3 weeks into a quiet post I had already found evidence I couldn't rationally categorize, felt at the time like a worse failure than staying and finding out what was actually happening. I told myself this was still procedure. I set 4 new trail cameras along the fire road leading to Tower 9, motion-triggered, infrared, checked their angles twice against my own GPS coordinates so there could be no argument later about placement error. I began keeping a second log, separate from my official patrol notes, purely for anomalies. The compulsive habit that had already half-destroyed one part of my life resurrected. Now, in service of understanding what was happening to the other part. And within 4 days, the forest gave me exactly what I'd asked for. The way it apparently always gave the ranger assigned to it exactly what he asked for, which I would come to understand was the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. On the 4th night, a Thursday, I woke at 1:58 in the morning to the sound of the station radio keying open on its own. I want you to understand what that means procedurally, because it's not a small thing. A radio doesn't key itself open. Someone, somewhere within range, has to be holding the transmit button, whether on purpose or by accident, for the channel to go live. And once it does, you hear whatever ambient sound exists on the other end. Wind, breathing, static, sometimes nothing at all but the specific quality of open channel silence, which is not the same as no signal. It's a silence with a shape to it. I sat up in the dark and listened to that shape for almost a full minute before I heard, faint underneath it, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps on packed earth, slow, even, moving away from wherever the transmitting radio was. And then so quiet I told myself for days afterward that I might have imagined it, a voice, not words, a single low sound, drawn out, that could have been a name if a name had been stripped of every consonant that made it sayable. I got up, I got dressed. I did not, and I want this on the record because it matters to everything I understand now. I did not walk toward the forest that night. I want you to know that the version of me that still believed in rules held that first time, and I sat at the station desk with my hand on the radio's volume knob until the channel closed itself, on its own, at 2:19 in the morning, 5 minutes after the timestamp on every single photograph of myself I had ever pulled from that first camera. In the morning, the trail cameras I'd set on the fire road had all 4 gone dark at 1:58, all 4 simultaneously, and had not recorded a single frame again until first light. Not motion-triggered footage of nothing happening. Dead. As though something had reached out and closed 4 separate lenses at the exact same instant, the way you'd close your own eyes. The station log, when I opened it that morning to write the entry for the previous night, already had an entry for 1:58 a.m. in handwriting that was, by then, close enough to my own that I genuinely could not, holding it up to the light, tell you with certainty which of us had written it. It read, Radio traffic unidentified, channel 2. Did not respond. He is patient. That is worse than if he weren't. I had not written that. I would swear that in any courtroom in the country, under any oath they wanted to give me. And I also recognized, with a dread that settled somewhere below my ribs and has never entirely left, the particular way the lowercase t was crossed. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you about the boy properly, because up to now, he has only existed to you the way he existed to me for those first weeks. A shape in a photograph. A description in a dead man's handwriting. A rumor Harlan didn't want to finish. On the 11th night since the first photograph, I saw him myself, and I want to describe it exactly as it happened, without smoothing any of the strangeness out of it, because the strangeness is the only honest part. It was dusk, not full dark. The hour the Forest Service calendar I keep pinned above my desk lists as civil twilight. The hour I had by then started closing the trailhead gate a full 40 minutes earlier than the posted schedule required, because some animal part of me had started keeping its own rules regardless of what the district office thought was necessary. I was walking the Boundary Fire Road on a routine equipment check, checking the 4 cameras that had gone dark, and I came around the bend where the old growth starts in earnest, where the canopy closes overhead thick enough that the light drops almost a full stop even at midday, and he was standing 30 yards off the road, at the exact edge where maintained trail gives way to the unmarked interior. He looked, at that distance, exactly like a boy who had gotten lost hiking and simply needed someone to walk him out. That is the specific horror of it, looking back, that my very first instinct, honed by 11 years of search and rescue, was relief. "There you are," I called out to him, the way I've called out to 100 lost hikers, using the calm, flat, deliberately unhurried tone you're trained to use so a frightened subject doesn't bolt further into the woods. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He watched me the way the boy in the photograph had watched the camera patient, unsurprised, as though I were the one arriving late to an appointment he'd been keeping for a very long time. I took 2 steps off the road toward him, and he took 1 step back, deeper into the tree line, without any of the stumbling or hesitation you'd expect from someone actually navigating uneven forest floor in fading light. It was less like watching a person walk and more like watching a photograph slide backward on a table. I stopped. He stopped. And in the last few minutes of usable light, close enough now that I could see the jacket he wore was thin, wrong for the season, exactly as the game camera had shown, I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with facial features and everything to do with some older, colder part of my brain, that I was not looking at Caleb Reyes. I want to be precise about that, because it would be the easier, sadder story to tell you that the forest had simply given me back the boy I'd failed, some cosmic mercy or cosmic cruelty built exactly to my specifications. It hadn't. This boy's face, in the 2 or 3 seconds I saw it clearly before the light dropped past the point where faces exist, was not Caleb's face. But he was, unmistakably, a boy who belonged to the same category Caleb now belonged to. In the terrible ledger I kept somewhere below language, a boy who had stopped at some point being found. He raised one hand slowly and pointed, not at me, past me, back down the fire road toward Tower 9, whose broken silhouette I could just make out above the canopy a half-mile east. A shape I had been specifically instructed by the district maintenance manual to avoid, structurally unsound, decommissioned, do not attempt entry. Then the light failed the rest of the way, and he was gone. Not retreated, not walked away. Simply no longer where the last of the light had shown him standing. The way a shape in your peripheral vision resolves into nothing once you turn to look at it directly. I did not sleep again that night either. I sat at the desk and I wrote everything down, every detail I could still hold on to before my mind started doing the thing minds do to protect themselves, softening edges, offering alternate explanations, and underneath the entry, in the personal notes column, I wrote the sentence that I think marks the actual moment, the old version of me, the rule follower, the checklist man, finally lost the argument he'd been having with himself since the first photograph. I wrote, "I think it wants me at the tower." And below that, unbidden, in handwriting that was by now indistinguishable from my own, no matter how carefully I studied it, someone had already written the answer, dated 3 days in the future, a date that had not yet happened. "You'll go anyway. You always do." I called the district office the next morning. "I want you to know that, because it matters, I did try, at that point, to do the responsible thing, the thing the old Owen Marsh, the Sable Ridge Owen Marsh, would have insisted on before anything else." I got the supervisor's voicemail because it was a Sunday, and I left a message that I can barely remember the exact wording of now, something about requesting an emergency consultation regarding unusual activity at the Whitlock post, deliberately vague because I had no language yet for what I actually needed to say. Nobody called back that day. Nobody called back the next day either. On the third day, when I finally reached someone, a woman in the regional office, who had clearly never heard of Whitlock and had to look up which district it fell under, she asked me, not unkindly, whether I was requesting a wellness check on myself. And I understood, hearing the careful neutrality in her voice, that whatever had happened to every ranger before me at that post had also, apparently, happened to whatever version of this conversation every ranger before me had eventually tried to have with the outside world. I told her no, that I was fine, that it was a minor camera malfunction I'd already resolved. I don't know why I said that. I think some part of me had already decided, even then, that I wasn't going to be rescued from this the way Caleb hadn't been rescued from Sable Ridge, and that the only mercy left available to me was to make sure I understood exactly what was happening before it finished happening to me. So I went looking, properly, the way I should have from the start, not for evidence to file, but for the truth, whatever shape it turned out to have. I drove back into Coro's Bend and found Harlan again, and this time I didn't dress the questions up as wildlife management. I told him what I'd seen at the tree line, and I told him about Voss's logbook, and I watched something in his face settle, not into surprise, but into a kind of tired confirmation, the look of a man who has been waiting years for someone to finally ask him the real question instead of the polite one. "Tower 9 used to be manned year-round," he told me, leaning on the counter in a way that suggested this was a story he'd told before, though clearly not often, and never to someone who'd need it as badly as I did. "Back before my time, but my father worked forest crews out here as a young man, before the mill closed. He told me the tower crew rotated every season, standard practice, same as any lookout post in the state, except Whitlock's tower crews didn't rotate the same way. He said there was always talk about which crew you drew, because some seasons, the man who went up that tower in spring came down different in the fall. Quieter, careful in a way he hadn't been careful before. And every so often, not every year, but often enough that people noticed the pattern, the way you notice a floorboard that's always cold even in summer, a tower man wouldn't come down at all. Official record always said transfer, or resignation, same as it did with Voss. My father's generation had a name for it, though. They called it being kept. I asked him what that meant, being kept, and Harlan was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. And then he said the thing that finally, fully reorganized everything I thought I understood about the shape of what I was living inside of. "There's things that get lost in these woods that don't rightly finish being lost," he said. "Don't ask me to explain that better than my father explained it to me, because I don't have the words any more than he did. But there's a difference out here between a boy who dies in these woods and a boy who's lost in them. Dying's a door. It closes. Being lost, really lost, the kind Whitlock does, is more like a hallway that don't have a door at either end. And halls like that, my father used to say, they need somebody standing in them, not to fix it, just so it doesn't stand empty. Because empty is worse. Empty is when it starts reaching further than the tree line to find somebody to fill it." I asked him, because I had to, whether that meant the boy I'd seen, whoever he was, whichever decade's failed search he belonged to, was still, in some sense, alive in there. Harlan shook his head slowly. "I don't think alive's the right word for what he is. I think he's waiting on the door that hallway don't have. And I think whoever's standing in that hall with him is the only reason the door hasn't needed to open onto something worse than one lost boy. He told me one more thing before I left, and it's the detail I've turned over more than any other in the months since, because it's the one that finally answered the question I hadn't let myself ask directly. Why me? Why now? Why a man who'd already lost one boy to the dark got sent, apparently by some bureaucratic process nobody could fully explain, to a forest that specifically, patiently, seemed to require exactly that kind of loss in the person assigned to guard it. "You didn't get sent here by accident," Harlan said, not looking at me now, looking instead at the window, at the tree line visible even from town if you knew where to stand. "Whitlock's had 11 rangers since my father's time that I know the names of. Every one of them came in carrying somebody they'd lost and couldn't find. I used to think the district office was just careless, sending grieving men to the one post that'd make it worse. I don't think that anymore. I think the woods asks for what it needs, somewhere up the chain nobody can see, and somebody up that chain always finds a reason to say yes." I drove back to the station that evening with the last of the light going copper over the ridgeline, and I sat in my truck outside the cabin for a long time before I went in, because I understood, finally, with the specific dread of a man who has just watched the last exit close behind him, that whatever transfer request I'd filled out 3 months earlier, in whatever state of grief and self-punishment had made Whitlock sound like exactly the quiet, meaningless post I needed, none of that had been my decision. Not really, not any more than Voss's had been his. I had been selected, not by any person, by whatever hallway Harlan's father hadn't had better words for, reaching out through channels neither of us could name and finding, in a search and rescue technician who blamed himself for a boy still lost somewhere under Sable Ridge snow, exactly the kind of man it needed standing in it. That should have broken something in me. I think honestly it did. But grief does something strange to a man who has spent his whole life organizing himself around rules, and what it did to me in that truck, in that dying light, was not despair. It was clarity. If I had been chosen for this because I already understood, in my body, what it costs to leave someone in the dark, then I understood finally what the actual test in front of me was. It wasn't whether I could solve the anomaly, file it, close it out with a clean report. It was whether I could do, for whatever was waiting at Tower 9, the thing I hadn't been able to do for Caleb. Stay, not rescue. I understood by then that rescue, in the ordinary sense, wasn't on offer. Just stay, past the point where every rule I'd ever built myself around told me to pull back. I went inside and I did not sleep, and at 1:40 in the morning, 40 minutes before the hour that had haunted every photograph and every log entry since the first day, I put on my boots. The same boots, still bone dry every morning no matter how many nights my other self apparently wore them through the wet timber. And I walked out the station door, and I did not turn on my radio because some part of me already understood that whatever was waiting for me had never needed the radio to know I was coming. The forest at that hour is not the forest you walk through at noon, wearing a uniform, carrying a clipboard, feeling the mild, comfortable authority of a man who is paid to be there. It is a different structure entirely, one that only reveals itself once the light that organizes it into trail and boundary and market distance has gone. The fire road, which I could have walked blind by that point, 3 weeks into learning every route and rut of it, no longer felt like the same road. Familiar landmarks, a lightning-split cedar, a culvert where the road dips to cross a seasonal creek arrived out of order, or not at all, or arrived twice. The cedar passing on my left, and then, 20 minutes later, on my left again, in exactly the configuration it should only exist in once. I want to tell you I stopped there, that some rational instinct took over and turned me back toward the station, and I want that to be true, because it would mean I still had some choice left in what happened. But the truth is, I didn't stop. I understood walking, that the road was rearranging itself specifically to keep me walking longer than the actual distance should require. The way a held note stretches a piece of music past where the ear expects it to end, and some part of me, the part that had already decided to stay past the pullback point this time, no matter what, simply let it. The trail markers, the blue plastic blazes nailed to trunks at eye level every quarter mile, the most basic and reliable orientation tool in the entire system I'd spent 3 weeks maintaining, were wrong. Not missing wrong. I passed one nailed upside down and another nailed to the underside of a low branch where no hiker would ever look. A third that I was certain, having personally re-nailed it myself 8 days earlier after a storm knocked it loose, had been moved 40 feet from where I'd left it, in a direction that led not toward Tower 9 but away from it, deeper into the unmarked old-growth interior where no maintained trail had ever run. I did not follow the blazes. I followed the light. Because by then, close to 2 in the morning, by whatever measure of time still applied out there, I could see it. Tower 9's cab window, 4 stories above the canopy, lit from within by a warm, unsteady orange-gold glow that had no business existing in a structure the maintenance manual insisted had been stripped of all wiring and fuel sources decades earlier. It was, unmistakably, lantern light. The same quality of light, flickering slightly, casting the same soft-edged shadows, as the light in every photograph I had of myself standing at the fire line at 2:14 in the morning, holding a lantern I have never once in my waking life purchased, packed, or carried. I walked toward it, and the forest, for the first time since I'd left the station, stopped rearranging itself around me. It let me go. That, I understand now, was its own kind of message, the difference between a maze that keeps a person wandering and a hallway that finally, once it recognizes who's walking down it, simply opens. I found the boy again before I found the tower, standing at the base of the access trail, exactly where I somehow already knew he would be, closer now than he'd let me come at the tree line 2 days earlier. Close enough that I could see, in the thin, gray, moonless light that made it through even that canopy, the small details grief keeps for you against your will. A friendship bracelet, faded on his left wrist. A scuff on his left shoe that looked recent, the kind of scuff a boy gets kicking a rock down a trail out of boredom rather than fear. He did not point this time. He simply turned and began walking up the access trail ahead of me, at a pace that matched mine exactly no matter how I adjusted my own steps, and I understood, following him, that I was no longer investigating an anomaly. I was being led somewhere I had already, on some level below language, agreed to go. The tower door, which the maintenance log swore had been welded shut in 1991, after a structural assessment condemned the whole platform, stood open. I climbed the stairs 4 flights, the wood soft with rot in places, sound enough in others that I understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, that someone had been maintaining this structure in the exact places that mattered and letting the rest rot for show, the way you'd keep the important rooms of an abandoned house clean and let the front porch fall apart to discourage visitors. The boy did not climb with me. He stopped at the base of the stairs and simply watched. And I understood, looking back down at him from the second landing, that whatever came next was not his to walk me through. He had done his part. He had led me to the door. What waited above the door was older than he was, older, I suspect, than anything with a face I could have recognized as a boy's at all. At the top, in the cab, in a room I had expected to find empty or ruined, or simply not there at all in the way the forest had been rewriting distances all night, I found Corwin Voss. He was alive, in the sense that a man can be alive after 11 years of grief and 11 more years of whatever this was. Thin in the specific way of someone who has stopped needing food the way the rest of us do. His ranger uniform gone gray and soft with age, but still, unmistakably, a Forest Service uniform. Badge still pinned at the chest, the number on it. When the lantern light caught it, the exact number stamped on my own badge downstairs on the desk where I'd left it. A detail the district office had never explained and I had never thought to question, because badge numbers get reassigned all the time. That's just how a small posting works. You don't ask why the metal in your pocket used to belong to somebody else. He was sitting in the lookout chair, the one piece of furniture in that condemned cab that looked recently used, and the lantern sat on the small table beside him, burning steady, the same cracked chimney glass from every photograph. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had the particular flatness of a man who has said the same sentence to himself so many times it has worn smooth of any feeling. "You took longer than most," he said. "Most come by the second week. You made it 3. I asked him it, and I want you to understand how strange it is to stand in a condemned tower at 2 in the morning asking a man who's been legally missing for over a decade a series of calm procedural questions. But that is exactly what I did. Because it was the only version of myself I had left to be. I asked him what he was, whether he was still, in any sense that mattered, Corwin Voss, or whether he was something the forest had made out of what was left of him. "Both," he said. "That's the part nobody explains right, because nobody who understands it is still able to explain anything to anybody. I'm Corwin Voss. I had a wife in Bellingham I stopped being able to picture clearly about 4 years in. I had a daughter I lost the same way I imagine you lost whoever you're carrying, before this post ever found you a river, in my case, not a mountain. But the water doesn't care what shape it takes you in. I came out here the same way you did. Quiet post, no peaks, no rescues, no radio traffic that sounds like a father's voice. And I found exactly what you found, in exactly the order you found it, because it always shows a man exactly enough to bring him here on his own feet, at his own hour, having made every choice himself all the way up those stairs." I asked him about the boy. Voss's face did something then that I still think about more than almost anything else that happened that night. Not fear, not grief exactly, but a kind of exhausted tenderness. The look of a man describing a patient he has cared for so long that the caring has outlasted every other feeling he might once have had about the situation. "He's not one boy," Voss said. "That's the mistake every one of us makes at first, because it's easier to hold on to one face than to understand what's actually standing at that tree line. He's every boy this forest's ever kept, that never got to finish being lost properly, never got a body found, never got a door closed behind them, the way dying's supposed to close a door. 60 years of them, maybe more, folded down into one shape, because one shape is all a mind like yours or mine can hold without breaking clean in half. He doesn't remember any one name. I asked him early on, same as you're about to. He doesn't have one to give you. What he has is what all of them had in the last hour, before the dark took them for good. The wanting for somebody to come. That wanting doesn't go anywhere just because the body it belonged to stopped being findable. It has to go somewhere. This forest is where it goes." I asked the question I had come up those stairs to ask, the only question that actually mattered, the one underneath every log entry and every photograph and every mile of fire road that had rearranged itself around me that night to make sure I arrived asking it in exactly this room, at exactly this hour. I asked him what happens if nobody stays. Voss looked at the lantern for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice dropped into something quieter, something closer, I think, to the man he must have been before 11 years alone in a tower folded most of the ordinary human softness out of him. "Then it stops being one hallway with one wanting boy standing patient at the end of it," he said. "It gets hungrier. It gets less careful about the difference between somebody who's already lost and somebody who's just standing too close to the edge of losing. I've watched it happen twice in 11 years, when a ranger left post without anybody ready behind them, and both times it took longer, reached further, before somebody new came to stand where I'm standing now. There was a hunter from 3 counties over, once. There was a research crew from the university that went in during daylight and came out, some of them not remembering 3 of the 6 names they'd started the survey with. Whoever's assigned this post is not decoration, Owen. You're not here to watch a haunting from a safe distance and write it up in a report district we'll never read. You're the door. As long as somebody stands where I'm standing, the wanting has somewhere to go that doesn't reach past the tree line. The day nobody does, that's the day it stops being one boy's story and starts being everybody's. I asked him, and this, I think, is the last fully rational question the old version of me managed to ask before something in me finally, completely, stopped being able to hold the shape it had built itself into after Sable Ridge, whether there was any way to actually end it. Not manage it, end it. Find every one of those 60 years of names. Give them the burial or the closure or whatever ceremony would finally let that hallway grow a door at the far end, the way Harlan's father had said it never had. Voss smiled at that, and it was not a cruel smile or even a particularly sad one. It was the smile of a man who had asked the exact same question in the exact same tower a very long time ago and had spent 11 years since learning the answer the hard way. "I don't know," he said. "I think it might be possible. I think somebody smarter than either of us, with more time than either of us gets, might find the way through it. But that's not the job you were sent to do, and it's not the job I was sent to do. And I don't think anybody who's ever stood in this room was sent here to solve it. We were sent to hold it. That's a different task entirely, and I've made peace, mostly, with the fact that it might be the only task that's actually on offer. You want to spend the rest of whatever life you got left trying to find the ending nobody before you found nobody stopping you. I'd only ask you to understand what happens to what's waiting at the tree line while you go looking." He stood then, slow, the way a man stands after sitting still long enough that his body has half forgotten the motion. And he picked up the lantern from the table, and he held it out to me across the small distance of that condemned room, and I understood, taking it, the exact weight of what I was accepting. Not a passing of duty in any formal sense, no ceremony, no words that made it official, just the plain physical fact of a lantern changing hands, warm from someone else's grip, the cracked chimney glass throwing the same soft, unsteady light across my palm that it had thrown across every photograph of myself I could no longer entirely disown. "What happens to you now?" I asked him, because it seemed, of everything, the one question I owed him an answer to before whatever came next. "I get to stop," Voss said, and for the first time since I'd climbed those stairs, something in his voice cracked open into a feeling I recognized without difficulty, because I had felt an echo of it myself on every radio call I'd ever made, pulling a search team back at nightfall. Relief laced through completely with grief. That's all any of us are actually asking for, in the end. Not rescue. Just to stop being the one who has to keep standing here alone. I do not remember walking back down the stairs. I do not remember the walk back along the fire road, though the road, when I think about it now, must have let me pass through it easily, without the rearranging that had stretched the outbound journey, the way a door doesn't resist you on the way out if you've already agreed to what's on the other side. I remember standing at the station desk at some hour before dawn, the lantern set down on the same table where the radio sat, and I remember opening the logbook to write the entry I somehow already knew would be there waiting, in my own handwriting, dated for a night that, as far as my conscious memory was concerned, hadn't happened yet. I woke at 6:40 the next morning, in my bed, boots by the door, bone dry, exactly as they had been every morning since the first photograph. For one long, merciful moment I let myself believe, the way I imagine every ranger before me let himself believe on whatever equivalent morning came for him, that the whole night had been a dream built out of grief and bad sleep and too much coffee. Then I looked at the desk. The lantern was there. Cracked chimney glass, kerosene reservoir a quarter full, exactly where I had set it down in a memory that felt, in the flat gray light of morning, more like something I'd read about happening to someone else than something I had done myself. The logbook was open to that night's entry, written in the tight, steady hand I have stopped being able to call only Voss's or only my own, because I understand now that it was never really a question of which of us had written it. It said, "Accepted post. Standing relief for C. Voss, effective this date, until relieved. Subject at tree line, calm through first light. No further incident." Below that, in my own hand, unmistakably, in ink I have no memory of setting to paper, was one more line. Tell the next one it isn't the boy who chooses. The same sentence, the same words I'd found in that logbook in the equipment shed, in handwriting I hadn't recognized on my second night at this post. I understand now who had written it originally, and I understand with a clarity I wish I could unlearn that I am not the last ranger who will ever read that sentence and not understand, yet that it is meant for him. I have been at Whitlock for a while now. I have stopped counting the months the way I used to count everything, in careful, verified columns, because some of what I would need to count no longer moves the way ordinary time moves out here, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing exactly how much of it has actually passed. My patrols continue. My reports still get filed with district, still get logged and dated and initialed, and as far as the official record is concerned, I remain simply the ranger assigned to a quiet post with an unusually low incident rate, which I suppose, in the strictest procedural sense, is even true. The trailhead register still fills with day hikers and the occasional overnight backpacker, and I still close the gate a full 40 minutes before the posted schedule requires, and nobody in Coro's Bend has ever once questioned why, because nobody in Coro's Bend needs it explained to them any more than I needed Harlan to explain, eventually, why some rules exist a long time before anybody remembers writing the reason down. I see the boy some nights still at the edge of the old growth, patient, unhurried, and I no longer feel the specific grief I felt the first time, the grief of mistaking him for Caleb, because I understand now what Voss meant when he told me the boy was not one boy. Some nights I sit with a lantern lit at the fire line, and I do not go further than that, and that, apparently, is enough to keep whatever wanting lives in that hallway from reaching past the trees, enough to be simply the door that a hallway like that requires in order not to stand open onto something worse. I have stopped asking whether I will ever find the actual ending Voss told me he didn't think either of us had been sent to find. I think some nights that I might spend the rest of my working life looking for it anyway, in the old growth's furthest, oldest stands, in county records nobody has cross-referenced in 60 years, in whatever answer exists. To the question of how a hallway like that finally grows a door, I think other nights that Voss was right, and that the looking is its own kind of grief I'm not yet ready to put down. What I know, the thing I am telling you this for, the thing I need whoever reads this to carry with them if they ever find themselves standing at the edge of a forest. They've been told, without much explanation, that nobody enters after dark, is that the rule is never the point. The rule is just the last visible edge of something that has already, quietly, decided who it needs standing inside it. Whitlock did not choose me because I broke a rule or asked a question at the wrong hour. It chose me the way it apparently always chooses, months and years before the chosen ranger ever fills out a transfer request, believing in his grief that the choice was entirely his own. I filled that form out myself, in an office 1,400 miles from here, certain I was running toward silence, toward distance, toward anywhere Caleb Reyes's father's voice couldn't reach me anymore. I understand now that I was not running toward silence at all. I was being called, the way a hallway calls for whoever's grief fits the shape of its particular door, and I said yes to that call in every quiet, procedural, checklist-driven decision I made in the 11 days it took the forest to finally show me what I'd already agreed to. I do not know who reads district personnel files closely enough to notice patterns across decades of postings. I do not know whether whatever mechanism selected Voss, and selected me, and selected however many rangers came before either of us, stretching back to whatever unrecorded first ranger first climbed that tower and first heard a boy's wanting reach out of the tree line toward him, will ever be interrupted by anyone smart enough or lucky enough to actually close the hallway rather than simply stand in it. What I know is this: 3 days ago, a transfer request came through district for a ranger currently stationed on a stretch of coastline 800 miles from here, a man whose file I was not supposed to have access to, but somehow, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, found open on the shared server when I went looking for something else entirely. His request cited career development. His most recent incident report, filed 4 months prior, described a rescue operation for a missing child that had been suspended at nightfall due to weather and never resumed in time. The posting he requested was Whitlock. I have not written back. I have not flagged the file or called district or done any of the careful, procedural things the old version of me would have insisted on doing before that man ever climbs into a truck headed for Coro's Bend. I have only done the one thing I understand now, that every ranger before me eventually did for the one who came after, the thing I still do not fully know how to feel about. I open the logbook on a fresh page in my own steady hand. And I began writing him a message I know he won't find until he's already 3 weeks into believing the quiet he came here for is real. Until the first photograph finds him, the way the first photograph found me, until he is standing exactly where I once stood, asking exactly the questions I once asked, of a man he does not yet know is waiting for him at the top of a condemned tower with a lantern already lit. I wrote, "You did not get sent here by accident." I have not decided yet how much more of it I'm going to let him read before the forest decides that for both of us.